Frank Fiore, but we have my co-host Paul Hollis, author of the Hollow Man series, is with us as well. Frank Fiore. Frank, I know you're excited about our guest, and you love talking to authors, don't you, Frank?
Yes, yes, especially rocking authors.
Yes. So our guest today is Universal Music executive turned writer David Junk, and he's going to talk the incredible story in his rock memoir, Rockin' the Kremlin. David, thanks for stopping by.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be on the show, Neil.
All right, let's talk first of all, and then we're gonna have Frank have a question, a follow. Why'd you write the book? Tell us kind of your background and why you wrote the book.
Well, I have wanted to write this book for a while, my history in Russia, because I knew I had something very unique in the music industry, opening up a record label, an American opening up a record label in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union was always going to be an interesting story for music business folks that like to read about those kinds of stories. And the first time Mariah Carey would come, Enrique Iglesias, some of the big artists come, I always knew that was going to be interesting. But when the war broke out in Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I realized the book had an even more immediacy to it, a more urgency to it, because I had witnessed Russia transfer from democracy to authoritarianism before my very own eyes while I was over there. So I write about it in the book as well too.
Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, wasn't rock and roll somewhat responsible for the fall of the Russian Empire?
I like to think so. I'm convinced it played a role. No, it really did. It really did, because it was a reason for people to unite against the government, because they were hiding from the censors. They were sneaking bootleg albums in of Beatles, Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, whatever, into the Soviet Union, being very careful about that, having secret parties in their country homes or in their apartments to avoid the censors. And they would copy the one person would bring the vinyl in, and they would make copies of it, believe it or not, on X-ray technician material. That's how they would make copies of other vinyls and share it with all their friends. And that just led to more and more rebellion against the authorities and against the Soviet Union. And I think it definitely played a role in the fall.
You said that you had your own label. Well, was it American rock and roll bands, or did you have some from Russia, Russian bands?
Both. So when I opened Universal Music in Russia, we of course represent the big stars like Elton John, Bryan Adams, Bon Jovi, U2, but also the job of a record label in a country is to find local artists and sign them, develop them, and with luck promote them around the world. And that's what I did. I signed more than a half a dozen Russian artists to Universal that we promoted in Europe and around the world.
Now, kind of explain. I wanted to go, and then Frank, you can go to the question.
Yeah.
How, when you said you represented certain labels in Russia with Universal, meaning they were U.S. based, like you talked about Elton John and all that stuff, do you have to have a record company in each country to market the albums, especially as you were like a Universal in Russia, your record, and basically that you need to have basically a subsidiary in every country then, right? To market.
You definitely do, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Now with the internet and Spotify and things like that, it's less necessary. But back then, someone like me was like a gatekeeper. I was the one responsible bringing music in or choosing which music not to bring in from the West, from America and from Europe. That was my main job. And obviously I was trying to bring in the hits as much as possible. But it really was something where for example, I got really excited about hip hop music, American hip hop music. And I started promoting music from the West Coast, from our labels Interscope and Death Row, and from the East Coast, Def Jam. And I was promoting that very heavily in Russia. And to this day, they have a very strong hip hop community of their own that built up based on the influence of Eminem and Jay-Z and Dr. Dre and those kinds of stars.
Okay, Frank.
Yeah. So what was the biggest hit by a Russian, a Russian band.
The band is called Tattoo. It's a duo, two girls. They were from Moscow. I signed them in early 2000. They were very controversial. They caused me a lot of heartburn, and were definitely a risky signing. In the book, I call them the most dangerous band in the world
Really?
because they kissed on stage
Oh
and in their
boy.
music video. And this is 2000. Remember, this is long before Britney and Christina did it with Madonna on MTV, or long before, long before any of that. And this was not a sexy thing. This was their being provocative. This was the new Russia being free and provocative and in your face and unafraid. And they did that. And of course, that caused a lot of trouble for us with the Russian Orthodox Church and some of the authorities. But their albums sold worldwide. They went gold or platinum in 27 countries. They were the first foreign act to debut at #1 in Japan. Even the Beatles weren't able to do that. So they beat the Beatles in that respect. And their album sold over 5 million copies, made $100 million for Universal Music. And they're still by far the most successul Russian act in music business history worldwide.
Did you
Now,
get any visits from the KGB?
I got visits from everybody there. I was watched. We were watched. I was the only American in show business in Russia at that time, and Universal Music obviously was a company that the authorities were keeping their eye on very closely because we were promoting nice music, fun pop songs from Elton John and Bryan Adams, but then we would have songs from Marilyn Manson too. So you never know, you can get anything. And so we were watched carefully. Yes.
what changes did you see in Russia, especially from the time after the Cold War ended and Gorbachev, and you started to see Russia really become free to where the freedom disappeared? I know you talk about this in your book, but it's intriguing for me to look at this because at the end of the day, if we don't keep an eye on every country in the world and how they interact or what happens, it might be too late. I mean, history's going to repeat itself. Look at Germany with Hitler.
Sure.
In World War I in Germany, they weren't as deadly, but they were the big ones in World War I. But if we stay out of it and we don't watch what's happening, before you know it, it's just going to become crisis after crisis after crisis. But when I'm talking about Russia now, oh my goodness. I mean, it just like that everyone started getting used to freedom and it disappeared.
It's one of the great tragedies of this century, I think, because when I got to Russia right after the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was so much excitement for America, for Russian America, U.S.-Russia relations. Our businesses were over there helping Russia transition from communism to capitalism to market economies. I played my part in the music industry, but there were people helping the Russians with everything from finance to oil to gas to manufacturing. And honestly, the U.S. government played a big role in supporting Russia's development after the end of the Cold War. It went south because of a couple of things. Boris Yeltsin, the president then, although he was a freedom fighter and pro-democracy, he was a raging alcoholic who could not keep sober, and the country suffered because of it. He really lost control. And there was a war in Chechnya, and that's a republic inside of Russia that Russia has for centuries had trouble managing that republic. And so those two factors led to the rise of Putin. Putin became prime minister and then eventually president. And he put Russia on a completely different track, this authoritarian track. And it's a real shame because I know a lot of Russians. My wife's father is one of the Russians that stood there with Yeltsin when he got up on the tank and was demanding the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, there was such a drive to to develop Russia into a real freedom loving country with democracy and fair markets. And it just got taken away from us by Putin. And that there's just no other way to describe it other than it was hijacked by Putin and his KGB cronies.
All right, Paul, I know you have a question as a rock fan and all that. What do you have, Paul, to throw to David?
Oh my gosh, so many. But I don't want to take away from you. I have 100 stories just like yours about rock and roll. But yeah, I go way back to Woodstock, and go forward.
Oh wow!
But
Oh, that's great. That's
yeah,
great.
but yeah, I'm just interested in Universal Records and how you got to Russia in the first place and started working there.
Well, I grew up in Ohio on a family farm, and this was Reagan's America, Ronald Reagan's America. So we were very fearful of the Russians, of the Soviets, and I grew up near an Air Force base called Wright-Patterson, very important one of the largest in the country. So we knew if there was ever a nuclear war, we're done, we're gone, we're ashes. That's just what you knew. So I lived in that sort of fear for years and years, and then of course Reagan's Evil Empire speech affected me too. I had a classmate at a college who was in a passenger jet that was shot down by the Russians over the Sea of Japan. I don't know if you remember that. That was in 1983, and Reagan called Russia the evil empire right after that. So there was a lot of reasons for me to never want to step foot in Russia, but when the Berlin Wall came down, Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, who had left Pink Floyd, staged the Wall concert, his famous Wall concert there at the Berlin Wall. And I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, and I had never seen the Wall concerts in New York or London or LA back in the late 70s, early 80s. So I went to Berlin. I was there, with 500,000 Germans and Eastern Europeans from all over who were there that night celebrating freedom. It was one of the greatest rock concerts ever staged in Europe. You had Van Morrison there, you had the band, you had Cyndi Lauper singing Another Brick in the Wall. It just really was a unique experience. But the most amazing thing was freedom was breaking out throughout the region. But you could feel it that night in East Berlin at Potsdamer Platz. And so I returned home inspired to go back to this part of the world and work and help and bring my American know-how. The one thing I had, as an American, right? And I returned to the U.S. I got a business degree. I started studying Russian because I was told everyone in Eastern Europe speaks Russian because they were forced to speak Russian. They didn't have a choice about that. They had to learn Russian in school. And so I learned Russian and business and went back there and applied, and companies were very eager for anybody with a business degree, but especially an American who would come over there and work. They were very eager to hire. And so I ended up in the music business. I would never have found a job in the music business otherwise, but they were looking for help. I answered a help wanted ad, literally a help wanted ad.
That's crazy. Well,
that's how I got in. That's my
I would
no
wish we
friends,
had
no
more.
family, just
I wish we had
wanted
more
ad.
time, but where can you can purchase your book? It's available on Amazon, all finer bookstores. Do you have a website too for your book?
Yes, it's Rockin'-the-Kremlin. And it's got videos from back in the 90s there in Russia and all kinds of extra stories. So please check it out, Rockin'-the-Kremlin.
All right. Thanks, David. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure.
All right. That's a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and Friday.